somewhere in the world right now. There is a living animal that every textbook, every museum exhibit, every scientific database on the planet declared dead 200 years ago. Not endangered, not critically threatened. Dead, gone, extinct. And yet, it breathes. A wildlife photographer named Elias Varga didn't know any of this when he uploaded a single blurry image to a naturalist forum at 2 in the morning. He wasn't trying to make history. He was exhausted, a little sunburned, and mostly just curious whether anyone could help him identify something strange he'd spotted near a creek bed in a remote stretch of the Carpathian Forest in Romania. The image wasn't even that clear. You could make out a shape, dark, low to the ground, moving through the undergrowth with a kind of deliberate, unhurried weight. Elias wrote 2 sentences beneath the photo. He said, "Saw this near the Eastern Ridge. Anyone know what it is?" By 6 o'clock that morning, his post had 400 comments. By noon, it had broken the Naturalist Forum's all-time traffic record. And by that evening, a zoologist at the University of Bucharest named Dr. Nadia Ferreira was on the phone with 2 colleagues in Berlin, speaking very quietly and very carefully, because she didn't want to say out loud what she was thinking. Not yet, because what she was thinking was impossible. What she was thinking would rewrite decades of accepted science. What she was thinking was that this blurry 2 in the morning photograph might be the most significant wildlife image captured in the last century. And she was right. This is the story of how a species thought lost to history survived, and what that survival means for everything we think we know about extinction. Let's start with a word that we throw around with enormous confidence, and probably shouldn't. The word is extinct. When scientists officially declare a species extinct, there's a process. It's not casual. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has criteria, thresholds, timelines. They require exhaustive surveys. They require years, sometimes decades, of no confirmed sightings, no physical evidence, no reliable reports. The process is rigorous. It has to be, because declaring a species extinct carries enormous weight. It changes how resources are allocated, how habitats are protected or abandoned, how conservation funding gets distributed. But here's what that process cannot account for. And this is the part that keeps certain biologists up at night. It cannot fully account for what it doesn't know. It cannot survey every valley, every cave system, every stretch of dense forest on Earth. It cannot interview every local community in every language. It operates, necessarily, within the limits of available data. And sometimes, the data is incomplete in ways that matter enormously. Dr. Ferreira, who has spent over 2 decades studying vertebrate ecology in Eastern Europe, put it plainly in a 2023 interview with the journal Conservation Biology. She said, "We declare extinction with the best tools we have. It's looking directly at the camera. Its body is compact and powerful. Its coat pattern, the dark rosettes on lighter ground, is exactly as described in Joseph Pethy's 1823 field notes 2 centuries earlier. And its eyes, I see catching the infrared, reflecting it back, are pale, almost silver. It looks like it's been there the whole time." Because it has. The species name that Dr. Ferreira's team formally proposed in their taxonomic documentation is drawn from the Latin for enduring and shadow. It is, in every sense, apt. This animal endured, in shadow. Without acknowledgement, without protection, without anyone fighting for it because no one knew it needed fighting for. And what that means, beyond the biology, beyond the conservation policy, beyond the scientific methodology, is something quieter and harder to quantify. It means that the world still holds surprises, real ones. Not the manufactured mysteries of entertainment, not the comfortable illusions of stories where everything lost eventually comes back, but actual, documented, peer-reviewed evidence that nature is more resilient, more secretive, and more persistent than our most careful accounting of it. Think about what else might be out there. Think about what other valleys we haven't entered, what other communities we haven't asked, what other tracks and what other mud might be waiting for someone to crouch down and look at them seriously. The silver-eyed cat wasn't waiting to be discovered. It wasn't hiding. It was simply living. Continuing. Enduring the way living things endure when the conditions allow it, which is, quietly, persistently, invisibly. Until one morning a tired photographer uploads a blurry picture to the internet, and somebody who grew up hearing the old stories recognizes what they're seeing. The lesson here is not, they're all out to. Here, don't worry, the lesson is sharper and more demanding than that. The lesson is, look harder, ask better questions, talk to the people who've been living beside the forest for generations. Don't confuse the limits of your observation with the limits of the world. And when someone comes to you with a grant proposal to search for a species you've already written off, maybe don't call it a fairy tale. Because sometimes the fairy tale is just a memory, and sometimes the memory is right. But our tools have never been perfect, and the wilderness has always been larger than our ability to observe it. That humility, that willingness to acknowledge the gap between what we know and what's actually true, is rare in science. And it's exactly the kind of thinking that changed everything here. To understand why this discovery hit so hard, you need to understand the animal itself. You need to understand what the world lost, or thought it lost, 200 years ago. The animal at the center of this story is the forest-dwelling subspecies of the European ground lynx, a medium-sized, powerfully built cat with tufted ears, a short, dense coat patterned in dark rosettes, and eyes that witnesses across multiple centuries described consistently as unusually pale, almost silver. It was never the largest predator in its range. It wasn't the most dramatic or the most feared, but it occupied an ecological niche that nothing else quite filled. An intermediate predator, controlling rodent populations, influencing ground-nesting bird distribution, quietly maintaining a balance in the forest understory that researchers are only now beginning to fully appreciate. It ranged across a broad swath of Central and Southeastern Europe, from the forests of Slovakia and Hungary down through the Romanian highlands and into parts of what is now northern Bulgaria. It appears in medieval hunting manuscripts. It's referenced, obliquely, in several Romanian folktales about a creature with silver eyes that watched travelers from the shadows but never attacked them. The Saxons who settled Transylvania in the 12th century called it, loosely translated, the Quiet One. And then, it disappeared. The last confirmed sighting on official record was made in 1823 by a Hungarian naturalist named József Petha, who described observing a pair of the animals near the Apia Ucini Mountains. He made detailed notes, he sketched them, and then, nothing. No further sightings, no remains, no reliable reports for 2 full centuries. By the early 20th century, the species was officially declared extinct. The museum specimens gathered dust, the folk stories got filed under mythology, the silver-eyed cat became a ghost. For 200 years, nobody seriously went looking. Now here's something that most people outside of biology have never heard of, and once you learn about it, you will see it everywhere. It's called Lazarus taxonomy, and the name, as you can probably guess, is a reference to the biblical story of the man raised from the dead. In biology, a Lazarus species is an organism that disappears from the fossil record or from modern observation for a significant period of time, sometimes millions of years, and then reappears, alive, physically present. Going about its business as though nothing happened, as though it simply stepped off stage for a while and forgot to tell anyone. The list of known Lazarus species is genuinely startling. The coelacanth, a deep-sea fish that was known only from fossils believed to be 65 million years old. Scientists assumed it had died out with the dinosaurs. Then, in 1938, a South African museum curator named Marjorie Courtney Latimer noticed one sitting in a fishing trawler's catch. It was 5 feet long, it was alive, it had been alive, and its species had been alive, continuously, the entire time. Millions of years of assumed extinction, undone by one observant woman and a very surprised fish. The Chacuan peccary, a pig-like mammal from South America, known only from fossils and believed extinct for 10,000 years until a living population was discovered in Paraguay in 1975. The night parrot of Australia, thought extinct for over a century, rediscovered in 2013. The Bermuda petrel, a seabird declared extinct for 300 years, found nesting on a remote island in 1951. The list goes on. And it has a consistent theme running through every entry, which is that nature is far better at hiding things than we are at finding them. Dr. Aurelio Bondi, a conservation paleontologist at the Natural History Museum in Vienna and one of the world's leading experts on European megafauna, described the phenomenon in a 2024 paper this way. Lazarus events remind us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. When we stop looking, we stop finding. The The animal doesn't cease to exist simply because our attention moved elsewhere. That paper, by the way, was published 6 months before Elias Varga took his photograph. Bondi later said the timing felt strange. Now I want to take you back to Dr. Nadia Ferreira, because her story is the spine of everything that follows, and it deserves to be told properly. Ferreira grew up in Cluj-Napoca, in the heart of Transylvania, in a family that took the old stories seriously. Not as literal truth. Her mother was a schoolteacher, her father an engineer, but as data, as cultural memory. Her grandmother used to tell her that the forests around their region had one slice. He held a cat with silver eyes that nobody ever caught and nobody ever killed, and that just because you stopped seeing something didn't mean it stopped being there. Ferreira carried that idea with her through her undergraduate years at Babes Bolyai University, through her doctorate at the University of Edinburgh, through a decade of fieldwork that took her from the Scottish Highlands to the Balkan interior. In 2022, she submitted a grant proposal to the Romanian National Research Council. The proposal was straightforward. She wanted to conduct a systematic, high-tech survey of 3 remote forest corridors in the Apuseni Mountains using a combination of camera traps, environmental DNA sampling. That's the technique where you collect soil or water samples and extract traces of genetic material left behind by passing animals, and acoustic monitoring. The target species was listed plainly as the European ground lynx, subspecies extinct. Her department head, who she has chosen not to name publicly, called the proposal well-written but scientifically unjustifiable. He suggested she redirect her energy toward documented endangered species. He used the phrase biological fairy tale. She submitted the proposal anyway, through a different funding channel, and received a modest grant from a private conservation foundation based in Zurich. She assembled a small team. A Romanian field biologist named Călin Munteanu, who knew the Apuseni terrain better than anyone. A German molecular ecologist from the Leibniz Institute named Dr. Petra Scholl, who would handle the eDNA analysis. A wildlife tracking specialist from Bulgaria named Radu Simov, who had spent 15 years documenting large carnivore movements in the Balkans. And a local guide, a quiet, weathered man in his 60s named Thomas Akim, who had grown up in a village at the forest's edge and who, when Ferreira explained what she was looking for, nodded slowly and said, "In Romanian, yes, I've seen it." Ferreira later said that moment made her hands shake. The expedition launched in late April of 2023. The first 2 weeks were quiet, methodical. The camera traps went up in grids across the 3 forest corridors. Soil samples were collected at regular intervals along game trails and creek banks. The acoustic monitors recorded at night. Dr. Scholl ran preliminary eDNA screens in a portable field lab that she'd set up in the back of a rented Land Cruiser. The results came back normal. Wolf, brown bear, red deer, wild boar. Everything you'd expect to find in a Carpathian forest, and nothing you wouldn't. The team maintained their scientific detachment. Ferreira was careful about that. She'd told them from the beginning, "We are looking for evidence, not confirmation. If it's not there, we document that it's not there, and we go home. No wishful thinking, no pattern matching to a result we want to find." And then came week 3. On the 14th day of fieldwork, Thomas led the team along a ridgeline that dropped into a narrow, steep-sided valley that didn't appear on any of their topographic maps because it was so small, so sheltered, so deeply cut into the highland terrain that it had simply never been formally surveyed. It was the kind of place that felt still. Ferreira described it later as feeling geologically private, like the landscape had been keeping a secret for a very long time. They came down into the valley along a dry stream bed, and they were discussing whether to set camera traps on the eastern slope. When Tomas stopped walking, he crouched. He was looking at the mud beside a small pool of standing water, and he was very, very still. Ferreira came up beside him. She looked down, and she stopped breathing. The tracks in the mud were feline, medium-large, 4 toes, no claw marks, retracted as cats do. The pad shape was consistent with a compact, heavy-bodied animal, and the gait pattern, the specific spacing between prints, the angle of approach to the water, matched nothing in Radu Simov's extensive field experience with Eurasian lynx, wildcat, or any other documented felid in the region. Simov crouched next to Tomas for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at Ferreira and said, "These are not from any cat I know." Here's where the story becomes something else. Because finding tracks is one thing. Tracks can be misidentified. Tracks can be ambiguous. Tracks, even very compelling tracks, are not proof. What happened over the next 72 hours was the process of building a case, and it was brutal. Not physically, but scientifically, because the pressure on the team to both be right and be certain was enormous, and those two things are not always compatible. Dr. Scholl collected soil samples from around the track site immediately. She ran an eDNA extraction that same evening in the field lab, targeting the specific mitochondrial DNA sequences associated with Felidae, the cat family, and cross-referencing against a genetic database that included every documented European felid species. The results came back showing felid DNA, and a sequence in the mitochondrial region that didn't match anything in the database. Not a contamination artifact, not a degraded read. A clean, consistent sequence that was clearly feline, clearly distinct, and clearly unknown. Ferreira called Dr. Bondi in Vienna at 11 o'clock at night. She read him the sequence data over the phone. There was a very long silence on the other end. Then Bondi said, "Send me the raw files, don't tell anyone else yet." Meanwhile, 3 of the camera traps they'd positioned in the valley caught something over the following 2 nights. The footage was not cinematic. It was grainy infrared. It was brief. The longest clip was 11 seconds. But in each clip, moving through the underbrush with that low, deliberate, unhurried weight was an animal, a cat, medium-large, compact body, and in one frame, captured at the precise moment the animal paused and turned its head toward the camera, Uha's 2 pale eyes caught the infrared light and reflected it back. Almost silver. Ferreira watched that frame on a laptop screen in a tent in the Apuseni Mountains at 2 in the morning, and she said, later, in a recorded interview, that she started crying and couldn't fully explain why. She said it felt like a door she'd thought was permanently closed had just opened. The verification process took 8 months. 8 months of genetic analysis, morphological comparison against museum specimens, peer review, independent confirmation, and careful, painstaking scientific argument. Dr. Scholl's eDNA results were independently replicated by a laboratory at Charles University in Prague. Additional camera trap footage was gathered across 3 more expeditions. A partial shed hair, found caught on a low branch near the valley site, yielded nuclear DNA that confirmed species identity beyond reasonable scientific doubt. The paper was submitted to Nature in January of 2024 and published, after the most intensive peer review process any of the authors had ever experienced, in March of that year. The title was measured, as scientific paper titles tend to be. It read, "Confirmed rediscovery of a presumed extinct European felid subspecies, evidence from environmental DNA, camera trap imagery, and morphological analysis." But the implications of that measured, careful language were anything but measured. The conservation biology world responded the way it rarely does, with something close to unanimous astonishment. Dr. Bondi, who had contributed to the paper's genetic analysis sections, gave an interview to the BBC in which he said, simply, "This is the most significant wildlife rediscovery in Europe in living memory, possibly ever." The mainstream press used less careful language, you can imagine. Now, here is the question that everybody asks, and it's the right question. How? How does an animal survive for 200 years completely undetected, in a region that has been continuously inhabited by humans, traversed by hunters and foresters and farmers and naturalists and scientists for that entire period? The answer, when Ferreira and her team laid it out in a follow-up paper published in late 2024, came down to 3 interconnected factors, and one of them is genuinely unsettling in what it implies about our assumptions. Factor 1. Geography. The valley system that Tomas led them into turned out to be part of a much larger network of deeply incised, geologically complex terrain in the Apuseni Highlands. Terrain that is, functionally, almost inaccessible without local knowledge. Not dangerous exactly, but confusing, disorienting. The kind of terrain where a path that looks like it leads somewhere loops back on itself, where valleys look like ridges from above, where topographic maps compiled from aerial surveys simply miss things because the viewing angle flattens the complexity. The population, and subsequent surveys suggest it is a small population, likely no more than 30 to 50 individuals, has apparently maintained itself within this terrain for generations, largely undisturbed. Factor 2. Behavior. Camera trap analysis and indirect observation data suggest that this animal is, profoundly, almost unnervingly, cryptic. Even by Felid standards, which are already high, it appears to be primarily crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, and moves with a deliberateness and spatial awareness that the team's behavioral ecologists described as exceptional, even among obligate ambush predators. It avoids open ground. It doesn't vocalize the way other felids do. Tomas, who had seen the animal twice in his life before the expedition, both times at dusk, said he'd never heard it make a sound. It hunts small to medium prey, rodents, ground birds, young deer, which means it has never needed to come into conflict with human activity in ways that would make it visible. And factor 3, this is the one that lands differently. Population genetics analysis of the eDNA samples reveals that this group has an extraordinarily low genetic diversity index, lower than expected even for a small isolated population, which means that at some point, the modeling suggests sometime in the late 18th to early 19th century, which aligns disturbingly closely with the date of the last official sighting. The population went through what geneticists call a bottleneck event, a catastrophic reduction in numbers, possibly to fewer than a handful of individuals. They nearly did go extinct. The extinction was real, in a sense, just not total. A remnant survived, and from that remnant, over 2 centuries of isolation, a small population rebuilt itself. Quietly, invisibly, in a valley that wasn't on any map. Think about that for a moment. A handful of animals, alone in the dark of a forgotten valley, carrying the entirety of their species' survival in their biology, and doing it without anyone knowing to root for them. Here is where the story takes a turn that I think deserves far more attention than it's received. When the research team began interviewing local communities in the villages at the edge of the Apuseni forest, as part of the broader ecological survey work that followed the initial discovery, they found something that should have been obvious from the beginning and wasn't. People knew, not scientifically, not in the language of peer-reviewed papers and genetic sequences, but they knew. An elderly woman in a village called Vidra, whose family had farmed the highland margins for 4 generations, described the animal in detail without being prompted. The size, the rosette markings, the pale eyes, and called it by a local name that translated roughly as the forest shadow. She said her father had seen one. She said her grandfather had seen one. She said the men in the village had always known not to set traps in the eastern valley because, and this is the part that stopped Ferreira cold when she heard it, because that valley belongs to the shadow cat, and it always has. An oral tradition, unbroken. 200 years of continuous local knowledge about an animal that formal science had written off as extinct, and nobody had ever thought to ask. Dr. Yemisi Adeyemi, an ethnobiologist at the University of Amsterdam who has spent her career studying the relationship between indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge and formal scientific documentation, reviewed the team's community interviews and published a commentary in the journal Ecology and Society in 2025. She wrote, and I want to read this carefully because it matters, "The rediscovery of this species is a triumph of field science, but the community knowledge data reveals a systemic failure. The information needed to locate this animal was available in the villages surrounding its habitat for the entirety of the period during which science classified it as extinct. The question we need to answer is not only how the animal survived, but why we never asked the people who already knew it was there. That question is uncomfortable. It should be. The implications of this discovery extend well beyond Romania, well beyond this single species, and into territory that has genuinely shifted the conversation in conservation biology. If a medium-sized vertebrate, a mammal, a cat, not a deep-sea creature in unexplored ocean trenches or an insect in a remote cloud forest, can persist undetected in a semi-accessible region of Europe for 200 years, what does that mean for the broader global extinction record? Dr. Ferreira has been careful about this. She doesn't want the discovery weaponized against conservation efforts, doesn't want it used to argue that species we think are disappearing might just be hiding, so why worry? That would be a profound misreading of the evidence. The population that survived is tiny. It survived because of a specific, unlikely combination of terrain, behavior, and fortune. It very nearly didn't survive. A few more hunters in the right valley, a few more harsh winters, a slightly different development pattern in the surrounding landscape, and there would have been nothing left to find. But what the discovery does do, productively, urgently, is challenge the assumption that our extinction assessments are complete. Dr. Bondi, in a lecture at the Vienna Natural History Museum in late 2024, made an argument that has since been widely cited. He said, "We have identified approximately 900 vertebrate species as extinct since 1500. Our survey methods for most of those assessments were, by modern standards, rudimentary. A systematic reanalysis using contemporary eDNA techniques, camera trap grids, and formal integration of traditional ecological knowledge could, realistically, result in the rediscovery of multiple species currently classified as lost." Multiple species. That's not a small claim. That's not a fringe position. That's a senior scientist at a major institution saying, "Go look again. Some of what we buried might still be breathing." A 2025 initiative coordinated through the IUCN, partly in response to the Ferreira paper, has now launched targeted reassessment surveys for 14 vertebrate species in Europe and Central Asia classified as extinct within the last 3 centuries, applying the combined methodology of the Apusini expedition. Results from the first 4 surveys are expected in late 2026. Nobody is making predictions. But nobody is ruling anything out either. Not everyone, it should be said, responded to this discovery with uncomplicated joy. Within weeks of the Nature paper's publication, a set of concerns began circulating in conservation policy circles that, while not challenging the scientific validity of the rediscovery, raised urgent questions about what comes next. Dr. Kamil Novotny, a conservation policy researcher at Charles University and one of the peer reviewers for the original paper, published an open letter in Conservation Letters, arguing that the discovery, if not handled carefully, could inadvertently harm the very animal it celebrated. His concern was this: the habitat. The valley network that has protected this population for 2 centuries derives its protective value almost entirely from its inaccessibility and obscurity. Once the location becomes broadly known, and given the level of international press attention it would become broadly known, it becomes a destination. For wildlife photographers, for ecotourists, for journalists, for well-meaning enthusiasts who nonetheless represent, to a population of 30 to 50 deeply cryptic animals in a small territory, an unprecedented level of intrusion. The very attention that celebrates the animal's survival could, Novotny argued, threaten it. Ferreira and her team anticipated this. The paper deliberately withheld specific location data. The valley system is referred to only by a regional designation, and the Romanian Ministry of Environment moved quickly to establish a protected zone around the broader habitat corridor. Access is now restricted to permitted researchers only. The local communities, whose traditional knowledge, Ferreira has been at pains to emphasize, was essential to the discovery, are formally recognized as stakeholders in the protection framework. But Novotny's broader concern about the relationship between discovery and risk lingers, and it probably should. There's a particular irony in the idea that 200 years of invisibility protected this animal, and that the moment we saw it, really saw it, the clock started ticking in a new way. The balance is delicate. Science has a responsibility not just to find things, but to think very carefully about what finding them costs. I've been sitting with this story for a long time now, and the more I sit with it, the more I think it's about something bigger than a single species in a valley in Romania. We live in an era of extinction announcements, of loss, of species decline curves that point steadily in one direction, and conservation reports that feel sometimes like reading a very slow obituary for the natural world. It's heavy, it accumulates, and it produces a kind of learned helplessness, a sense that the trajectory is fixed, that what's gone is gone, that the best we can do is manage the rate of loss. And then, a cat with silver eyes walks out of the dark, and everything resets, slightly. Not because one rediscovery reverses the broader crisis, it doesn't. Not because the extinction rate has slowed or the pressure on wildlife habitat have lessened. They haven't. But because of what this particular story says about the nature of the possible. About the relationship between what we've declared finished and what is actually finished. About the gap, which turns out to be significant and real and worth taking seriously, between our maps of the world and the world itself. Dr. Ferreira, in the acknowledgement section of her original paper, wrote something that has stayed with me since I first read it. She wrote, "This discovery belongs, first and most truly, to the animal itself, which survived without our knowledge or assistance. It belongs secondarily to the communities who remembered it when science forgot. It belongs to science only in the sense that science finally caught up. There is a photograph, taken on the third night of additional camera trapping, after the initial eDNA results had come back, when the team had repositioned their equipment along a game trail descending into the valley from the northeastern ridge. It's an infrared image. Black and white, grainy, the trees rendered in that flat, slightly alien way that night vision cameras produce. In the center of the frame, partially obscured by a low branch, a cat is standing completely still.